sixth graders. So today's topic is internal and external quests. Today we're going to focus on a quest story structure, which is very common in fantasy stories. We're also going to push ourselves to track external and internal quests the characters face. So before we get started, let's have a turn and talk. Let's define either of these two words, both internal and external. If you know what they mean, turn and talk to the person next to you and share. Ready? Go. Wonderful. So, as many of you have already said, internal is inward, personal, not obvious from the outside. External is outward, very obvious from the outside. So let's take a look at some of these titles that I have pictured up here. What patterns are you noticing about these stories? Let's think for a second. What do we notice or what do we know about these stories that they all have in common? Great. So as many of you said again, today's teaching point is that most fantasy books use a quest structure. Experienced readers investigate the internal quest as well as the external. So the character in your fantasy novel is probably on a quest. Once you know to expect a quest structure, you'll begin to see it everywhere. Sometimes a quest involves rescuing a captive or a sacred object, like in Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Other times, the quest may just ask the hero to destroy a villain, like in Harry Potter, or a dangerous object, like in Lord of the Rings. Or sometimes the main character may have just gotten themselves stuck in another world or place, and the quest is just the journey out of there, just like Alice in Wonderland or Chronicles of Narnia. So, the interesting thing is that we can recognize that the character in your novel is probably on a quest. He or she is probably trying to accomplish something big, and he or she is going to have to overcome a series of obstacles to accomplish this task. So let's look at some examples. The first example here is the quest from Lord of the Rings. First, a call is heard, and Frodo discovers he must destroy the Ring of Power to stop Sauron. Then a hero sets out on a journey where Frodo with the Fellowship, Frodo embarks on a journey through Middle-earth. Then he encounters some troubles. He's pursued by ring wraiths and orcs. Frodo struggles to Mount Doom. So we notice this dip here because there's some troubles happening. So now back up, Frodo reaches Mount Doom and destroys the ring. He completes the mission. Peace is then restored to Middle-earth. So this is an example of the quest structure from Lord of the Rings. Here's another example from Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Many of us have read or heard about this series, and this is an example of a hero's journey story arc. So in Act 1, you have an ordinary world. You're called to adventure. You might even refuse. Then he meets with a mentor, and he's crossing the threshold into Act 2, where there's a special world. Percy's encountering tests, allies, enemies, his approach to the inmost cave, an ordeal, and then there's a reward of seizing the sword. And then the road back, you're in Act 3, we're back to our ordinary world. The road back, resurrection, return with elixir. So this is another example of a hero's journey. And our final example, which I actually like this one the most because it highlights both the internal and external quests. This is another example of the hero's journey chart. So at the start, again, the character is called to adventure, they meet a mentor, they cross a threshold. At this point, we're leaving the normal world into the world of the unknown. There are some trials and failure. They might have a helper. They're growing with new skills. Maybe a death and rebirth, maybe some revelations. There are some changes, atonement. They might get a gift or a reward. Then they come back to the normal world, changed. And the end of that chart, the hero's journey. So, for external quests, outward, readers need to really think about the big problem or goal. Then they should think also about the series of smaller obstacles that the character faces. So for our example that we read with Miss Julia was the Paper Bag Princess. So Miss Julia went ahead and drew us a chart of a story arc for the hero. In this case would be the Paper Bag Princess Elizabeth. At first, Elizabeth is living in a castle engaged to Prince Ronald, and then the dragon destroys the castle and steals Ronald. So Elizabeth begins her quest. She knocks on the dragon's door, she outsmarts the dragon, and saves Ronald. Then Ronald is rude to Elizabeth, ew. And then Elizabeth and Ronald do not get married. She actually says, you know, you're very nice, but you are a bum. Your attitude sucks, essentially. Right. So that's another example of an external quest. This shows the problems and goals that Elizabeth had in the beginning and the obstacles she faced along the way. So thinking about the quest itself is interesting because it calls your attention to some of the smaller obstacles and gets you to thinking about how they might be connected to a character's greater task. But I want to show you one more thing. It's also interesting to consider the character's internal quest. So let's look at that. For internal quests, readers really need to think about what's inside the character that gets in the way. What is the character going through or thinking about that's in the way of successfully accomplishing their goal? Are they flawed? Most of your characters are flawed. That's normal. They might have something that they have to fix or figure how to get around, whether it's personal, which it usually is, an internal problem. There are personal conflicts that character may need to overcome. So, for example, in Harry Potter, he's dealing with the issues of not feeling like he has a family to belong to. That sucks. And in A Wrinkle in Time, Meg struggles with really low confidence. So for internal quests, you know, we might have some personal conflicts that our characters are struggling with. And we might even relate to those conflicts. So let's go back to the Paper Bag Princess and look at the internal, which is in purple, and we already went over the external. So in the beginning, Elizabeth thinks she's happily engaged. Then Elizabeth is left with nothing. She's quickly thrown on a paper bag and decides, you know, I'm not going to sit and sulk and mope. I'm going to put this paper bag on and I'm determined to rescue Ronald. So she goes after to rescue Ronald from the dragon. And then Elizabeth realizes or knows that the dragon is really self-absorbed. She's really clever though and uses that against him to outsmart him. So when Ronald insults her by being rude to her, she stands up for herself, which we should all do, and calls him a bum. And they do not get married. So now we get to see both the internal and external quest that Elizabeth from the Paper Bag Princess embarked on. Right? So it's very fascinating to think about both these quests, isn't it? As an inexperienced reader wouldn't even know that his or her fantasy followed a quest structure. And of course, we are experienced readers. A more experienced reader like yourselves would see that structure. Now you know, like, clearly this is a fantasy and this is the structure that's happening. And an even more sophisticated reader, like you, or as you aspire to be, might see an internal quest as well as an external one. So some of you might notice both at the same time, and that's okay. That's great. We want that. So again, for example, the external quest was to outsmart the dragon and rescue Ronald, but internally, Elizabeth really had to quickly adapt to how quickly life was changing and obstacles that were thrown at her. And she had to learn how to stand up for herself very quickly and not tolerate poor treatment. So, quickly, let's have a turn and talk. What do you think you're going to put on a quest timeline for your fantasy book? Let's turn and talk. So here's my example. On Elizabeth's internal quest chart, I would mention how she stands up for herself, and at the end of the story, by breaking things off with Ronald. Boo Ronald. So let's have a turn and talk. What's something you're going to put on a quest chart for your character in your book? And mention if it's an external or internal obstacle. Ready? Go. Great. So do you see how we were able to think of the main character and consider what he or she is most trying to accomplish? Then we consider the smaller tasks that may happen on the way to completing that task. And then we finally considered what is inside of the character that is getting in the way. What internal flaws do they need to overcome? These are all great reasons to write Stop and Jots. Can't wait to read them. See you next time.